Starting us off here at number 10 is The Jungle Book. Based on Rudyard Kipling's novel of the same title, the story was taken on by Disney and adapted into several beloved films about self-discovery and the harmony of man and nature. But few people, including myself until today, knew the true story of the wolf boy Mowgli. In 1867, a young boy was discovered by a group of hunters hiding out in a cave. The boy spoke no human language, nor did he understand human behavior, and they quickly figured out he'd lived in the jungle for his whole life up until then, being raised by wolves and believing that he too was one. They brought the boy back to a nearby orphanage where missionaries named him Dina Sanchar, meaning Saturday, which was the day he was brought to them. The boy, having never interacted with humans before, mimicked the behavior of an animal, walking on all fours, only eating raw meat, gnawing on bones to sharpen his teeth, and in an attempt to communicate with the missionaries, he would growl or howl like a wolf. They began trying to train the boy into a human lifestyle, trying to teach him how to walk on 2 feet and speak, but he never truly acclimated. Later in life, he eventually wore clothes, walked as a human, smoked cigarettes, and came to understand language in his own way, but he never learned to speak it himself. Next up at number 9 is The Hunchback of Notre Dame. This movie is already on the darker side of the Disney canon, and although much of the story is simply an animated retelling of Victor Hugo's fictitious tale, there is one person who was actually real. Quasimodo. In a memoir by British sculptor Henry Simpson, he describes the time he spent working in Paris repairing the Notre Dame in the 1820s. But after getting fired from that job, he was sent to work outside the city, and it was there he met a man named M. Trahan. Trahan was the lead carver on his crew, whose boss, while never mentioned by name, was in fact humpbacked and was almost exclusively referred to as the Hunchback. The Hunchback was a government sculptor who mostly kept to himself, but he and Trahan operated in the area of Paris where Victor Hugo lived. Hugo closely monitored the restoration of the Notre Dame and likely knew the Hunchback, if not personally, at least watched him from a distance. And not long after, he published The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1831, and well, the rest is history. Coming in at number 8 is Newsies. Before the turn of the 20th century, a huge strike nearly took down the newspaper conglomerate of New York City. At the time, the newspapers were handed out by young men called newsies. These boys were head-to-head with the rich moguls William Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, who owned the 2 largest newspapers in the city. Now, to be clear, when I say boys, I mean some as young as 7. The big problem was that at the time, the system required the newsies to pre-purchase their newspapers for the day. A stack of 100 papers cost 50 cents, and then they would sell them for a penny each. But if they didn't sell them all, well, too bad. The company wouldn't buy them back. Things only got worse once the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, and publishers began charging 60 cents a stack for the same 100 papers. Once the war ended, most other publishers lowered their prices back down, but not Hearst and Pulitzer. The newsies were struggling to compete with the other companies' lower prices, and then it all came to a head when they found out their high-priced bundles weren't even 100. They were totally being scammed. So in 1999, the boys began a strike against their cash cow bosses and marched all over New York City to spread awareness of their cause. The boys gained so much public sympathy that in just 2 weeks of striking, the moguls lost so much money, they agreed to speak with the newsies and come to an arrangement. Eventually, they settled on maintaining the 60 cents price, but that the publishers would buy back all unsold copies at the end of the day. Against all odds, the ragtag boys went out against the rich and powerful. So maybe not an evil story, but a true one nonetheless. Coming in at number 7 is Snow White. The story of Snow White has been passed down over hundreds of generations. Most know by now that Walt Disney himself didn't come up with the tale, and that it was first transcribed by Brothers Grimm in the 1800s. But apparently, it could go back even further than that. In 1994, a German historian named Eckhard Sander wrote a highly controversial paper that claimed he had discovered evidence that the story was actually inspired by a true event from the 16th century. Apparently, the real-life princess was actually a German countess named Margaret von Waldeck. Margaret, too, had an evil stepmother who at just 16 forced her out of the house and away from her family. But while away, she met a young and handsome prince, and the pair fell madly in love. But Margaret was forbidden from marrying him. Now, I wasn't able to track down exactly why she was forbidden, but I'm gonna guess and say it had something to do with money. Tragically, at the age of 21, Margaret was poisoned by the hands of her wicked stepmother in order to keep her from marrying the handsome prince. And I mean, minus the whole death part, it's not actually that far from the Disney retelling of the fairy tale. Hercules. I know what you're gonna say, the story of Hercules is based on Greek mythology, and you're not wrong. But I still added it because the actual mythology of Hercules and Megara is shockingly darker than the story portrayed on the animated movie. So in the movie, Hercules is the half-human, half-god that falls in love with sarcastic and lovable Megara. Megara is enslaved by Hades, and Hercules eventually frees her, and they live happily ever after. Well, in the original myth, Megara is actually the eldest daughter of King Creon and Princess of Thebes, and the two don't actually fall in love, but rather she's given as a gift to Hercules, or rather Heracles, after he saved Thebes single-handedly from the minions. Over time, Megara bears him several sons, but things go south fast after Hera sends Heracles into an unstoppable madness. You see, Hera deeply hated Heracles, for he is but a reminder of all the affairs committed by her son, also brother, Zeus, and Heracles has some pretty bad mommy issues about this, even though she was not in fact his mother. In his fit of madness, he kills his entire family, and riddled with guilt, he enslaves himself to his cousin Eurystheus and performs the 12 labors in an attempt to atone for his sins. So, I mean, just a few changes from the Disney movie, right? Tarzan. As it turns out, Mowgli was not the only Disney character based on a real-life jungle man. The story of Tarzan actually comes from an English nobleman. His name was Lord William Charles Midland, and he was the 14th Earl of Streatham. But one day he thought his life was over after being stranded and shipwrecked on the jungle coast of Africa in 1868. On his very first venture into the jungle, William stumbled upon a colony of apes. Of course, they had never seen a white human before, but shockingly, instead of running from him, they seemed curious and chattered excitedly amongst themselves. He says after their initial surprise of their new company subsided, they began to accept him as one of their own, offering nuts and roots for him to eat. The young boy, starved, accepted their offerings with a smile, but as his body wasn't built to eat such things, it didn't sit well with him. Quote, "I was terribly ill afterwards, and the apes appeared to understand this. One ancient female hunched her way over to me and cradled me in her arms." He spent the next 15 years living amongst the apes as one of them, and while he never communicated with them in their own language, he did learn how to sort of sign in a way to relay information back and forth. Eventually, after 15 years, he managed to make his way back to London and wrote about his time with the apes, inspiring the story of Tarzan. Coming in at number 4 is Rapunzel. Back in the year 1275 CE, a man named Jacobus de Voragine recorded a story of a young woman named Barbara from Italy. Barbara was a very beautiful girl with a rebellious spirit, and she lived with her powerful and rich father Dioscorus. Men were always lining up to woo his daughter, many of them princes, but he made the rule that all suitors could only meet her after an interview with him. One day her father had to leave town for a business trip, but after an argument with her father about wanting to be more independent, he locked Barbara up into a tower to keep her from meeting up with suitors behind his back. Townspeople had been instructed to deliver food to her as she wasn't permitted to leave, and one day someone left a book explaining Christianity. What you have to understand is that at the time, Christianity was viewed as a religious cult that Romans were trying to prevent from taking over. Not only that, it was also straight up illegal, and you could be killed for converting to it. Still, Barbara read the book and fell in love with Christianity and decided she wanted to convert. She used her beauty to convince the nearby workers to send over a doctor who was actually a priest in disguise, and in the biggest act of rebellion she could do at the time, she was baptized. When her father came home, he discovered what his daughter had done and reported her to the authorities. She was then dragged by her long hair to the town square where she was beaten, tortured, and burned by her community before finally her own father chopped off her head with a sword. I mean, what? Coming in at number 3 is Dumbo. I have to admit, This one hit me extra hard because as a kid I was obsessed with this movie. But I hate to admit that I'm not shocked to have learned that an animal was abused while at the circus 150 years ago. The movie Dumbo is based on a real-life elephant, Jumbo, who arrived at the London Zoo in 1865. For starters, before he arrived in London, he was captured by hunters and separated from his mother, who he watched be slaughtered for her tusks. They then took the terrified thing to a completely new continent and stuck him in a cage to be gawked at by the public, who routinely threw coins or other things at him. Soon he was becoming so aggressive, I wonder why, that they decided to sell him to P.T. Barnum's traveling circus in the US. On his now second cross-continental journey, he became so anxious that they began providing him with a daily allotment of whiskey to calm him down. But all this did, of course, was get the poor animal addicted to alcohol. Alone and confused, Jumbo began grinding down his tusks on the bars of the cage, and it seems Barnum's fix for most of the elephant's ailments and stressors was to keep pouring alcohol down his throat. Soon enough, the poor animal was almost always sedated, often knocking back bottles of champagne, port, whiskey, and even biscuits soaked in booze. Further, he was used as an attraction that visitors could ride, so much so that his joints began deteriorating at a rate far beyond his actual age. He died young after an accidental hit by a freight train, which, likely due to his rapidly deteriorating health, caused enough internal bleeding to send him over the edge. But even after his death, they wouldn't let him rest. He was put up for a display in the New York City's gala for the next 4 years and paraded around as a roadside attraction for the masses. Coming in at number 2, Pocahontas. It probably comes as no surprise that the 1995 classic strayed wildly from the harsh reality of its dark history. In the Disney movie, the settler John Smith comes to the New World seeking gold and to settle on the land, but ends up falling in love with Pocahontas and coming together to bring peace amongst the settlers and the Powhatans. While the movie touches on the tensions between the Powhatan people and the white colonizers, it's a very sanitized version of the real events. First of all, her name wasn't even Pocahontas. It was Matawaka. Pocahontas was only a nickname meaning naughty one or little brat. Next, in Disney she was portrayed as a vague young adult age, but truthfully young Matawaka was just 10 years old at the time John Smith came to colonize her family's land. While she did save his life, Disney left out the entire part of what happened after. Matawaka was kidnapped by the white settlers and held hostage while being forced to convert to Christianity. She was then forced into marrying John Smith, a man who was more than twice her age as a minor, by the way, and promptly given a proper English name, Rebecca. From there, she was plopped into English society, clueless and afraid, and paraded around like some kind of proof that indigenous people could be civilized and melt into European society. Then, at the mere age of 20, she died in England far from her family and the life she loved. So sad. And finally, at number 1 is Beauty and the Beast. Back in the 1500s, there was a man named Pedro Gonzalez. Pedro was born with an incredibly rare Ambra syndrome, a condition where you are covered completely in hair, and was shunned and outlawed by his community as a freak. At the age of 10, the Venetian ambassador kidnapped him and then gifted him to King Henry II as a slave. At the time, owning outlandish people that were different from high society was a point of pride and upped your status among the court. Sadly, as he had been abandoned in his early years, he didn't speak very well and was essentially treated like a pet. Pedro was trapped in a cage in the king's court and fed raw meat to keep him alive. Then one day he was brought to the doctor, and terrified, the boy finally told him his name. But the king decided that it was far too Spanish sounding and changed it to Petrus Gonsalves. Petrus lived like that for years, treated like an animal to please high society, until one day Henry died and the queen decided she wanted to try a little experiment on her late husband's gift. The queen realized that if one hairy man was valuable to the court, then owning lots would only up her ranks in society. So she arranged a marriage with a local servant girl named Catherine. Allegedly, Catherine was chosen for her distinct beauty, but had no clue that the queen was marrying her off to Petrus until she saw him on their wedding day. The couple had several children, 4 of which were born with the same condition, and eventually given as gifts to other high-ruling members of the court, just as their father had been. In the end, there wasn't even a record of his death, as he was considered too animal-like for a Christian burial. Starting us off at number 10 is Davy Crockett. In the 1950s, Disney released a TV miniseries based on the life of beloved American West hero Davy Crockett, which was so successful that they went on to make 2 more movies further diving into his adventures in the Wild West. Now, as you can imagine, in Disney's version, he was shown as sort of an everyman defending the Alamo in song, but the reality of Davy Crockett is not quite as peachy. Back then, the Frontier Army viewed the Western cowboys as no more than intruders and troublemakers who defrauded the indigenous people just as quickly as the rich landowners they so vehemently despised back east. To double down, Davy Crockett was also a key player during the Creek War of 1813. Despite claiming to support the locals of the land, he certainly wasn't helping reduce any conflicts with the indigenous peoples trying to regain what was rightfully theirs. In fact, he was actually fighting against them. After the war, he took his hand in politics, advertising himself as a man of the people, which may have been true to some extent, but after things started going downhill, he admitted to lying during his campaign and even passing out booze to sway voters. Also, let's not forget that despite being outwardly opposed to slavery, he owned slaves. Despite being outwardly pro for the rights of the indigenous people, he campaigned against them and was just overall kind of a hypocrite. So essentially, nothing like his Disney portrayal. Next up at number 9 is Anastasia. I know what you're thinking, this isn't a Disney movie, but I will counter that by saying that Disney has since bought out Fox, so technically speaking it is a part of the Disney canon, which I understand could be a stretch, but it's based on a crazy real event, so I had to add it to the list. The beloved movie tells a story of a young Russian princess who runs away from her palace in an attempt to survive the Russian Revolution. However, during the escape, hits her head and suffers amnesia. Eventually, she comes to with the help of her childhood music box, and there is a happily ever after. Now, believe it or not, there is actually more truth to the story than you might have even known. Obviously, we know that the events surrounding the plot, like the Russian Revolution, Rasputin, and the Tsar Nicholas II, were all real people and real events. But as it turns out, the story of Anastasia herself may have been based on a real person too, Anna Anderson. Historically speaking, the youngest daughter of the Tsar really was named Anastasia, and she really did go missing. Then along came a lady named Anna Anderson who claimed to be the real-life Anastasia. Now, because at the time there was no DNA testing, all they had to go off of was the fact that they had no proof of a dead body being discovered and that this woman was the right age to be the long-lost daughter of the Tsar, so many people believed it to be true. Then along came the movie in 1997, seemingly confirming the tale of the long-lost princess. But by 2007, DNA proved that was all one long con after, and that Anna was in fact not the long-lost daughter. Coming in at number 8 is Aladdin. Of all the Disney characters I might have guessed have a real backstory, I have to say I would not have guessed Aladdin. But according to historians, this rags to riches story was actually based on a figure named Hannah Diab. Similarly to Aladdin, he rose the ranks of his society, but not with the help of a genie living inside a magic lamp, instead his rich uncle who owned a clothing shop. It's believed that he told his story to Antoine Galland, a French archaeologist who became famous for being the first to translate 1001 Nights into French before adding the story of Aladdin to the book. However, despite it allegedly being the story of his life in a loose sense, and despite it being him who told Galland the tale, he was never credited. His story became essentially folklore among his community, creating the idea that the modest could ascend into the upper class by wishing upon a lamp. Coming in at number 7 is Cinderella. As we all know, in the Disney version, there is a wonderfully kind princess enslaved to her wicked stepmother who, with the help of her fairy godmother, goes to the ball, falls in love with the prince, and despite losing a shoe, finds him once more and lives happily ever after. You might even be familiar with the darker Grimm's fairy tale version where the evil stepsisters cut off their respective toes and heels in an attempt to fit into the shoe offered to them by the prince. And while the story itself is almost entirely fictitious and has been retold countless times throughout history, there is reason to believe that it is actually based based off of a very, very real practice from ancient China, foot binding. Foot binding was a practice where the feet of young girls were mutilated into a folded over shape, making them incredibly small, something that gave them high status and was seen as a sign of beauty at the time. In one of the earliest versions of the story, entitled Ye Xian, it follows the same tale as they always do, and when the time comes that the prince finds the shoe, he's astonished at how small it was. No woman is able to fit the tiny golden slipper except for Ye Xian, as her feet were bound and thus incredibly small. It may not be the most connected Disney story, but it's absolutely based on an old folklore tale about a very real practice that was only outlawed in 1912, so definitely deserves a spot on the list. Coming in at number 6 is Mary Poppins. If you've ever seen the movie Saving Mr. Banks, then you already have an idea about the truth behind the beloved character of Ms. Mary Poppins. Unlike how Disney portrayed her in the original version written by P.L. Travers, she depicts a much more stern and angry woman who could have very well used a spoonful of sugar herself. But it's not just that. The character of Mary Poppins herself was actually based on P.L. Travers' real life aunt. Tragically, in her early years, she lost her father to alcoholism, and it wasn't until the arrival of her Aunt Ellie that life began to feel stable again. However, unlike the Mary Poppins we all know and love, it was a lot less song and dance and more of a no-nonsense type. For years, Disney tried to get the rights to her story, and she was not keen on this idea, but eventually, after enough persuasion, she gave in. However, it should be noted that she absolutely hated the film adaptation and thought it was a complete betrayal of her novel, and apparently cried through the entire premiere, later recounting that she wished it could have been filmed by the British. Next up at number 4 is Mulan. Although the story is based on a folklore tale dating back to 420 CE, there has been speculation that the actual warrior of Mulan could have very well been a real woman. Either way, the story is crazy and definitely much darker than how it's portrayed by the Disney franchise. It starts off similarly. Hua Mulan disguises as a man to take her father's place in the fight against Genghis Khan, as he is far too old and her brother too young. From there it diverts as she heads off with her parents' blessing and is already incredibly trained in martial arts, sword fighting, and archery, and manages to go undetected in the army for 12 whole years. It's not until she's offered an official post that her true identity is revealed when she changes back into her girl clothes, preparing to return to her family. Upon her true identity being discovered, another woman named Du Xianyang, the emperor's daughter, is thrilled to find out the truth, and the two become best friends, continuing to fight. But not long after, their king is overthrown and the women are forced to surrender. They offer to be killed if the condemned men are spared, but their offer is turned down and they are told to return home. However, her return is anything but a happy ending, as when she arrives she finds her father dead and her mother remarried, and she's ordered to become a concubine for the rest of her days. Refusing to face such dishonor, she takes her own life after saying, "I'm a girl, I've been through war and have done enough. I now want to be with my father." Definitely not the same Mulan I saw as a kid, that's for sure. Winnie the Pooh. Back in 1914, Lieutenant Harry Colburn, who just so happened to have graduated from vet college prior to being enlisted in the war, came across the strangest thing he'd ever seen at the train station. There, in plain sight, was a black bear cub, mere months old, at the end of a leash, for sale. He walked over to the trapper only to discover that he had killed the cub's mother but wasn't able to give the cub the same fate, so he was looking to sell her. There on the platform, Colburn offered him $20 and returned to the train with his new pet. He named Winnipeg after his hometown in Canada. The bear and Colburn sailed to England and became best friends over his 7 months of training, until he was called to the trenches of France and knew he couldn't bring his beloved Winnie with him. So he decided to give her up to a local London zoo, as she was too domesticated to live in the wild, all the while promising to come back for her once the war was over. The bear was remarkably calm and sweet, so much so that children were actually permitted to enter the pit and ride on Winnie's back and even feed her right out of their hands. It was at this very zoo that a young boy named Christopher Robin saw Winnie for the first time and fell in love. He grew so fond of the bear that he named named his own stuffed bear after her. This led to young Christopher Robin naming his other stuffed animals, which eventually served as inspiration for his father's famous writings. All that from a bear bought for 20 bucks in a train station. Ratatouille. As much as it pains me to admit, most of this story is obviously very fictional. There was never a prodigy rat who cooked his way into the heart of a cold food critic, but there was a very real character that was based on a real person. Remy the rat's cooking inspiration, Chef Gusteau. While in the movie, Chef Gusteau died of a broken heart after one of his stars was removed by the scathing food critic Anton Ego, the man he was based on, Bernard Loiseau, had a much more tragic end to his life. Loiseau had once said in a 1980 interview that it was his life's ambition to earn 3 Michelin stars, which he actually achieved in 1991. This boosted his career and celebrity, prompting him to write dozens of cookbooks and even release a high-end frozen food line, and it seemed as though he was on top of the world. But soon there were rumors that Loiseau's 3-star status was under legitimate threat, and that he was gonna lose one of his beloved Michelin stars. The rumors seemed to come from leaked excerpts of a famous French magazine's head food critic François Simon, and tragically those excerpts would be the final straw for Loiseau. Once Loiseau told a journalist that he would take his own life if he ever lost a Michelin star, and tragically in 2003, Chef Bernard Loiseau did exactly that. The world lost a great chef to a rumor about a loss of a conceived credibility. I mean, it is crazy the kind of thing Disney decides to make a movie about. Coming in at number 2 is Sleeping Beauty. There are countless versions of the Sleeping Beauty tale that have existed for centuries, but for the most part, that's all it's been. A story. But according to some historians, there is a possibility that all the variations are actually based on real people and real events from the 6th century, particularly a very dark version of the tale dating back to the 17th century. In this version, Sleeping Beauty falls into a coma after a splinter of flax gets stuck in her finger, and rather than meeting Prince Philip in the woods and falling in love, a king riding past sees a woman sleeping in a castle and decides this is an opportune moment to enter and have his way with the unconscious lady. After his deed is done, he gets back on the horse and rides off into the sunset. 9 months go by and he never revisits the sleeping woman, but he did leave her with something, 2 growing humans inside of her. The king had his own queen back at the castle, so he did not want her to find out about what he had done, hence the lack of visitation for 9 months. One day the twins are born and somehow the woman is still not woken. So the twins, directionless, begin to suck on her finger thinking it would give them milk, and in doing so suck out the flax that had put her into a coma all those months ago. Once she's awake, she tends to the twins, and not long after the king comes back to claim the fruit of his loins. At this point his actual wife becomes very angry and tries to kill his mistress, and when that doesn't work she tricks the king into thinking that the twins are dead, but this only ends with the king killing her out of anger. In the end, the twins were fine, and the cheating man who committed essay on a sleeping woman lives another day. If all that really is based on a real story, it might be one of the most messed up origin stories of all. And last up in our number 1 spot is Song of the South. Maybe one of the most controversial Disney films of all time. The Song of the South was released 77 years ago and was marketed as being based on life in the American South. The live-action meets animation movie was based on the story Uncle Remus, written by George Harris. Harris had written his novel about his life growing up in Georgia during the Civil War and consisted of a compilation of tales told to him by former slaves. But once Disney got its hands on it, the tone shifted to a much less historically accurate depiction. The Disneyified version of the South portrayed plantation life as a happy-go-lucky world where slaves would spend their days singing about how wonderful their life is, and advertised a strange, almost romanticized relationship between masters and their slaves. It truly just painted an incredibly inaccurate picture of how the white people of the American South treated black people at the time. Arguably, some of the only good that came from it was that James Baskett was the first black man to receive an honorary Academy Award for his performance. But even so, there was a lot of debate around the win in his community, as it was such a harmful stereotype being portrayed under the direction of a white man. As you can imagine, this film is not available to be watched watch today. Disney has said they will never release it onto the streaming platform, and they have even replaced all the rides at Disney parks that had connections to the film.
At number 9 is The Little Mermaid, the princess whose hair, whether wet or dry, looks like it's in a Head and Shoulders ad for the entirety of the film. I mean, seriously, who has that much volume? I'm in awe. Great hair aside, Ariel has a great heart as well. Even though the Disney version leaves her with a happily ever after, as it always does, the original story by Hans Christian Andersen doesn't really follow that trope. In the original version, Ariel still trades her voice with the Sea Witch, but her punishment for failing isn't just turning back into a mermaid, it's straight up death. With every step, her feet feel like they're stepping on daggers, and even after that, she still dances for Prince Eric, but to no avail. He ends up marrying another girl who he thinks saved him from the shipwreck. I mean, do your research maybe, Eric, before you marry someone? But before dying, Ariel's sisters sell their hair to bring her a dagger, saying if she kills the prince, his blood will turn her feet into fins again. But of course she can't do it, she loves him too much, and she ends up turning into sea foam at the very end. This is a perfect example of a guy leading you on and then just wasting your time. Coming in at number 8 is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Fun fact of the day, this is actually Disney's first feature-length animated film, and if that is a well-known fact, then just disregard me trying to be knowledgeable and cool. In the Disney version, Snow White and the prince end up getting married after he awakens her with that true love's kiss, and the evil queen dies by lightning striking a cliff that she was standing on. Maybe don't stand on a cliff next time if you don't want to die? Just a suggestion, just saying. The original German story isn't too different from the animated version. Instead of asking the huntsman for Snow White's heart in a box, she asks for her liver and lungs in a box because she wants to eat them for dinner. The princess is in her glass coffin when the prince finds her, but he falls in love with her anyway even though she's technically dead, and takes her coffin away whilst doing God knows what with it and her. The apple dislodges from her throat miraculously after a year of not dislodging while she was in the coffin, and she finally wakes up. The queen has to dance at their wedding wearing hot iron shoes until she dies. Honestly, props to you, Snow White, at least you got revenge. At number 7 now is The Hunchback of Notre Dame. This is actually the second Disney movie I ever watched, and I actually used to watch it on VCR if anyone still knows what that is. I used to have to wait for the whole thing to rewind to the beginning just to watch it again, but oh my god, it was such a good film. The story itself is rife with so many issues and ups and downs and fire and death and beauty and all that is Disney, but the original is even more morbid. The original story by Victor Hugo ends well for absolutely no one. In Disney's version, Quasimodo, our resident hunchback, and Frollo both fall in love with Esmeralda, our resident gypsy, and Quasimodo ends up killing Frollo at the end. Sorry, spoiler alert in case no one's seen it already. In Victor's version, Frollo frames Esmeralda for attempted murder and she gets sentenced to Quasimodo still does push Frollo off a roof, but that's because he's laughing at Esmeralda being hung. Sicko. He then goes to her grave and refuses to leave, so much so that he actually dies of starvation at her grave. I mean, I don't want to say he died in vain, but he could have lived. At number 5 is The Fox and the Hound. Again, I didn't know anything about the plot of this film until this video, and I don't know why. I feel like this is a recurring theme. I haven't watched any of the Disney films that center around animals, but I've seen all the princess ones. I mean, what does that say about me? Well, anyway, the story is a friendship-based Tom and Jerry chase-like film wherein Copper, who becomes a hunting dog, and Chief, his owner, try and kill Todd the fox for the majority of the film, but friendship prevails. In the Daniel P. Mannix version, the fox, Todd, is raised by a hunting family, not a farmer, and then is released back into the wild. So far so good, no one's died yet. But then Todd starts taunting all the other hunting dogs as revenge, and one of them actually ends up breaking free and is hit by a train while chasing Todd. Next, Todd dies from exhaustion from the chase, and another dog also reaches his expiration, meaning he becomes too old and he also has to be shot. I just feel like 3 animals just died at once and it really could have all just been avoided. Coming at number 4 is Beauty and the Beast. Let me just get this out of the way. Animated version, loved it. Live action version, loved it even more. I never liked Emma Watson in any role but Hermione, but she was the perfect Belle. In the original fairy tale, it's not the Beast that's seen as evil. Belle's not actually an only child. She has 2 sisters, and I'd say they're the evil ones. In the original, the Beast allows Belle to go home as long as she comes back after 1 week, which are, I mean, generous conditions pigeons for a hostage. When she meets her sisters finally, they try and get her to stay home for longer by being nice to her in the hopes that the beast would get angry and eat Belle when she returned to the castle. Belle already had bad luck with the whole being kidnapped by a beast thing, but having mean siblings was just the cherry on top. Oh, and she's also half fairy in the original, and her and the beast turn out to be cousins. I'll just leave you with that one. Number 3 slot is Mulan, our girl proving to everyone that girls can do everything that guys can do, and sometimes even a bit better than they can. Also, you don't need to ask me twice, most of you are probably like, we didn't even ask you once. But yes, I'm absolutely stoked for the live action adaptation coming out next year, let's have it. In the film, the Hans end up defeating the Huns, and Mulan ends up saving the emperor and wins the war, and then goes back home. In Hua, Mulan's original poem that the movie is based off of, China actually loses the war completely. The Khan from the enemy side lets Mulan live, but only if she lives with him, so naturally our quick-witted girl escapes from that situation ASAP. When she finally gets home, she learns that her dad died while she was away and her mum remarried, and then she proceeds to herself in order to be with her dad. Now number 2 is Cinderella. Oh my god, I legit just love Cinderella. I saw the cartoon so many times, I thought her dress was the most stunning thing ever. I was like, I'm gonna wear this to prom when I grow up. But let's not even talk about the live action version, because that was also on point. I mean, there are many origin Cinderella stories, one even has a love interest for her ugly stepsister, but there's no fun in choosing the boring origin story. The Brothers Grimm, on the other hand, had a much more bloody version. We're talking Game of Thrones red wedding level. In their version, when Prince Charming gets to Cinderella's house, her sisters both cut off some of their toes and parts of their feet in order to fit into the slipper. Pigeons swoop down to show the prince the blood because apparently he couldn't see the red blood in a transparent glass slipper, and he realizes they're phonies. Then, as if the sisters haven't been through enough, some birds come and peck out their eyes during Cinderella's wedding. I mean, I know they're not nice girls, but the Brothers Grimm literally have zero mercy.
Number 10. The Rescuers, and the number 13. So, to ease into all of the scary truths, we are exploring a true fear that one of the main characters from The Rescuers has. Main Mouse Bernard has a fear of the number 13. The number 13 is commonly associated with bad luck in Western culture. When you go to a hotel, many don't have a 13th floor because they don't want to associate with bad luck. Bernard's fear is next level though, making it enough to be a phobia. Triskaidekaphobia to be exact. This is a written account of this fear, the number 13, dates back only to the late 1800s, but became common enough by 1911 that it got the name Triskaidekaphobia by combining the Greek word for 13 with phobia, which means a fear of. All in all, our boy Bernard from The Rescuers has some strong feelings about the number 13. Do you have strong feelings about any numbers too? Any particular ones? Also, I have another truth about The Rescuers, and this one was a bit of a scandal, so grab some tea and get ready to get into it. That brings us to number 9, The Rescuers' Hidden Photo. Although the film came out in 1977 and was out on Laserdisc and VHS since 1992, no issue was found until 1999. The issue was with an objectionable background image about 38 minutes into the movie. This image was of a topless woman that was in 2 frames of the movie when Bianca and Bernard fly in on a sardine box on the back of Orville through the city. An important thing to note is that the frame rate for Disney movies is between 24 and 60 frames per second. So, only being visible for 2 frames means that the image was only visible for a 1/12 of a second, which is about 0.083 seconds. So, who broke the news about this if you could only find it by freeze framing at the right moment, knowing when that moment is? Disney did. That's right. They made a public statement about it, saying it must have been inserted in post-production, and that they were recalling 3.4 million copies of the movie. That's a lot of VHS tapes. Could it have been a publicity stunt? I don't know. Number 8. Disney and recycling animations. This truth has been going around for a bit, but I wanted to include it because there's a bit of misinformation buzzing around it as well. If you look at the hand-drawn animated Disney movies, there can be some overlap in how some sequences turn out in the final production. For example, there's a movement in Robin Hood that looks an awful lot like some movement in Aristocats, and the dance scene in Beauty and the Beast looks the same as the one in Sleeping Beauty. This has led to a lot of outlets saying that the animators were recycling animation for either time or money, you know, all those reasons, and they kind of jumped to conclusions in some cases, because this wasn't always the case. In 2015, on his website Geek Dad, Jim McQuarrie asked former animators on these movies what really had happened in these situations. Animator Floyd Norman said it was because of director Wolfgang Wooly Reitherman. According According to Norman, Ratherman liked to play it safe and only use stuff he knew would work, which led to similar animation over many of the movies he directed. Also, Gary Truesdale, co-director of Beauty and the Beast, said time was the reason for the dance scene making you see double. As they were kind of cut for time, Ratherman had already made it so that using previous sequences was alright. So Truesdale said they resized and repositioned the Sleeping Beauty animation and then cleaned up the characters to make them look like the ones you see in Beauty and the Beast, and changed the colors too. This information was shocking to me, so I had to share it, and okay, I know it's not the spookiest, but the next few make up for that. Alright, that brings us to number 7, Finding Nemo and Other Lost Fish. In the movie, Nemo escapes the dentist down the toilet believing that all drains lead to the ocean, and this idea had influence. Children began flushing their fish down the toilet believing this was true. The LA Times wrote about this and also what really happens to the fish when they are flushed down the toilet. Because no, they don't go to the ocean. First of all, most flushed fish die from trauma or shock from hitting fresh water if they're a saltwater fish. If a fish survives the swirling journey, they still won't make it to open waters though. They would end up in a sewage system where the bacteria, chemicals, and gases would poison or drown the fish with asphyxiation. But if somehow your fish was super strong somehow and they still would try, they still wouldn't make it because the only thing that makes it to open water is water. The fish would be taken out as a solid at a water treatment plant. So don't flush your fish, please, especially if they're alive. Alright, number 6, Princess and the Frog. 2 months after its release in 2010, an article came out in Metro that said young Disney fans had fallen ill after kissing frogs, like in the movie. This article was citing a salmonella outbreak in the States, but it wasn't known for certain that it was because of kissing frogs, so it's likely that this story was spun. That being said, there's truth in one part of it. Kissing frogs can give you salmonella. Amphibians are well known to carry salmonella and can give humans the infection salmonellosis from contact with them. It's advised young children don't mirror the princess and having a frog of their own because of their weakened immune systems, so just don't go around kissing frogs cause catch a bunch of stuff. Now let's jump from frogs back to fish, or half fish, that is. Brings us to number 5, The Little Mermaid, and the Little Mermaid song that was almost cut. We all know, regardless of how much you liked it, that The Little Mermaid is a classic. The thing is, it could have been released without its iconic song, Part of Your World, and that's terrifying. In a Polygon interview with Jodie Benson, the voice of Ariel, she said that in early test screenings the song didn't perform well, which is absurd. The 4-minute song wasn't doing well with its target audience, kids. The Disney chairman at the time, Jeffrey Katzenberg, noticed kids were getting restless and distracted during the song, even throwing popcorn around, and he wanted to axe the song. What saved this beautiful song was the song's lyricist, Howard Ashman, who apparently said, "If this song goes, I go." And to that I've gotta say, thank you, Howard Ashman, for an anthem. On to number 4, A Sleeping Beauty Truth. So, The Little Mermaid came out in 1989, 30 years after the last princess movie, Sleeping Beauty. And why? Well, Sleeping Beauty wasn't the only sleeping thing with this movie. The movie originally bombed. Called a sleeper movie because of its delayed profits and possibly because it put theatergoers to sleep, the movie originally only made $5.3 million. If you're looking at me like, Abby, what about inflation? Just stop there, kid. It cost $6 million to make the movie originally, so it originally came out as a loss. Now, though, it's nearly 10 times the original $5 million with a lifetime gross of $51.6 million. So it kind of grew from there. If you ever showcase something and it's not getting stellar reviews, don't sweat it, because Sleeping Beauty, it shows. People barely remember the truth that it bombed, so don't get too worked up about your own personal failures. Now let's go to another princess with number 3, Tangled's pricey truth. Adjusted for inflation, as I talked about earlier, Sleeping Beauty cost a little over $53 million with today's valuation, and that pales in comparison with Tangled. Tangled is the most expensive animated movie Disney has ever made. It's also the most expensive animated movie of all time. It is my favorite Disney movie though, so obviously it was worth it, you know. The studio spent an estimated $260 million back in 2010 to make Tangled. That's $250 million. Also, Ranker adjusted against 2019 inflation to say that it would be equivalent to $320 million today. And it's more expensive than the Titanic to make. And the Titanic the movie, not the boat, I'm not sure about that. But why was it so expensive? Some people think it's because there was storyboarding and writing dating back to 2000, 10 years before the movie's release, but there are no sure answers out there right now. The good news, though, is Disney more than doubled their profit with a gross profit of over $590 million. Also, talking about profitable, let's jump to number 2, Frozen, and specifically Frozen names are references. Frozen's original title was going to be The Snow Queen, which is also the name of the work that the movie was based on. Pardon me here. Snedroganin, I hope I pronounced that right, aka The Snow Queen, was written by Hans Christian Andersen. When you think of that name, countless childhood stories may come into your head, but listen to it again. Hans Christian Andersen. Now, listen to 4 main characters in Frozen. Hans, Kristoff, Anna, Sven. Hans, Kristoff, Anna, Sven. Hans Christian Andersen. I rest my case. Also, the 4 names were confirmed on the Frozen IMDb to be a reference to the author. A little something snuck in there. Also, on another note, what's another thing characters Kristoff, Anna, and Sven have in common? No mothers. Which brings us to number 1, no mother characters. You may have noticed how a lot of Disney characters don't have mothers or parents, but specifically mothers. This could be because many Disney tales are based on old fairy tales where they too didn't have mothers or either parent, but this could also have been for other reasons, and Disney producer Don Hahn gave 2 more in an interview with Glamour. 2 more reasons, that is. The first reason Hahn said there wouldn't be any parents is because of plot. Most Disney movies are about growing up and accepting responsibility, and a quick way of doing that is losing your parent or both parents. An example he used was of Belle from Beauty and the Beast. She only had her father, and then her father was taken away, so she had to step up, grow up. The second explanation for no mother was because of Walt Disney's past. Walt's mother died tragically in a house that Walt bought for his parents. A carbon monoxide leak from the furnace hospitalized his father and led to his mother's death. Walt Disney was traumatized and felt personally responsible. From there, Hahn says that's why Walt steered away from mother characters in future films. I know that last one was sad, but it's important to know that it wasn't Walt's fault, and regardless of the tragedy that happened, he has and continues to impact many lives with his stories of growth.